Chapter 5. 3 Communes in the East. The eastern coast of Venezuela, which connects with the Antillean archipelago, is the zone of the first European invasion into the region. Here, Spanish settler colonists made initial advances from their Caribbean safe havens onto the mainland some 500 years ago, only to be strongly rebuffed by the Carib peoples. Later, the British intruded here too, occupying the island of Trinidad in 1797, while their burgeoning commercial interests crept upstream along the Orinoco River basin. These lands were also the base from which the final chapter in the Venezuelan independence struggle would be launched 200 years ago, relying both on the participation of indigenous peoples and on resources provided by the recently liberated Haiti. The upshot of this region's complex and combative history is that even today, the territory is crisscrossed by diverse cultures and traditions and has varied geostrategic linkages. It forms a kind of palimpsest on which some of Venezuela's most glorious moments of anti-colonial resistance and rebellion are inscribed. The story of eastern Venezuela's struggles, however, is far from over. The latest chapter in this rich history is being written by new generations of Venezuelans who are committed to socialism and are attempting to restructure society through the communal model that former President Hugo Chavez promoted from 2009 forward as the path to the socialist future. To get to know the region's socialist communes, some of which are said to be very advanced, Sira Pascual Marquina and I embarked on a trip that took us first to coastal Barcelona, then to the lush Valle de Guanape, and finally to Cumanacoa, in the region's sizable hinterland. The aim of this investigation was to see what was being born in this diverse and varied territory, under what influences, and what all of it boded for the future. Luisa Carceres Commune in Barcelona. Shortly before we arrived to Barcelona, our first destination, a high-profile visitor had come to the area. This was the much-watched YouTuber Luis Arturo Villar, Luisito Comunica, who had come with his team, camera, and checkbook in hand to Barcelona's Lecheria neighborhood. Lecheria is one of the most privileged urban developments in the country, forming a kind of bubble for the super rich, who often arrive in private airplanes to avoid the hoi polloi that might interfere with the good life they have between enjoying the tropical climate, perfect Caribbean beaches, and exquisite food. Luisito's aim in visiting the region was to buy a luxury apartment, taking advantage of the low real estate prices that resulted from the country's economic crisis. The young YouTuber recognized the problems that most Venezuelans experience in the U.S.-sanctioned country, such as lack of electricity and scarcity of basic goods. However, he also told his audience that he likes to invest with a view to future profits, and the apartment's extremely low price made it a great deal. In the end, Luisito was so delighted with his new acquisition that he dedicated an entire video to celebrating the bonanza. A fully equipped beachside apartment he had obtained for almost nothing. Yet the realities of working-class revolutionary Venezuela were not far away. No one would imagine that at a short distance, albeit in a much poorer neighborhood, was one of Venezuela's most successful urban communes. This commune is called Luisa Carceres de Arismendi, after a 14-year-old patriot who disarmed and shot her royalist captors in the struggle for independence 200 years ago. Because the commune is inside Venezuela's sizable port city of Barcelona, the Luisa Carceres initiative can be seen as a test case for urban communes. These present a unique set of problems for the communal movement. However, since most of the country's population lives in these zones, such problems cannot be ignored. Prominent among them is that all communes need to have a productive base. But what can an urban commune produce? A rural commune can grow food crops or raise cattle. An Andean one can cultivate coffee and cacao. A seaside commune can do fishing and fish processing. Yet urban areas, which are mostly residential in Venezuela, remain something of a riddle for the communal movement. For Luisito, the opportunity presented by an urban area fallen on hard times may have been clear: speculation on property values. But what can a socialist commune do in the concrete jungle of Venezuela's huge cities? The 5-hour drive that takes Sira and me from Caracas to Barcelona, passing by the Anzoátegui's state giant oil refining and shipping operations, goes quickly. When we arrive at the Commune's headquarters, we encounter a half-acre walled lot with various shipping containers along its perimeter, as well as a garden and improvised gazebo. The communard who receives us, Carlos Herrera, sits us down in the gazebo and bluntly explains the dilemma of Venezuela's urban communes. What grows here in these cities, he pauses for effect, are just shops and alienation. Carlos briefly recounts the commune's 6-year history, focusing on its various false starts and finding a viable economic project. Most of its initial efforts in developing productive undertakings ran aground. However, the communard's stubbornness paid off when they finally discovered a solution, which turned out to be as crude as it was obvious. The fact that all cities produce trash, and lots of it. So with the rebellious spirit worthy of its pistol-slinging forebearer, the Luisa Carceres Commune has tackled head-on the problem of having a source of income in an urban area by taking over an important section of the city of Barcelona's garbage collecting. This was not the Commune's first income-generating project. Rather, it is one they arrived at after other experiments. An initial project of the Commune was processing corn flour, the primary staple in Venezuela, used for making arepas, hallacas, bollos, and empanadas. They obtained the machinery to grind and package the product and even attempted to go up the supply chain by seizing land in the nearby township of Mallorquin, where the raw material, white corn, could be cultivated. Yet the Luisa Carceres communards found that after a short time, they could not compete with the producers in the private sector. We lost the battle to sell corn flour, Carlos says, but in the process, we learned about supply chains and the need to plan our undertakings. Luckily, another option emerged when the one-time television reporter Luis Marcano, who was then mayor of Barcelona, made good on a campaign promise that he was going to transfer responsibility for city services to no fewer than 9 local communes, each of them charged with trash collection in its respective area. The communards at Luisa Carceres seized upon this opportunity. Their doing so turned out to be fortunate for residents in the zone, for as things played out, the other 8 communes quickly gave up the ghost. They were less aggressive, allowing the former municipal truck drivers to continue working in trash collection, which led to conflicts, because these drivers were not fully committed to the project. By contrast, the Luisa Carceres communards understood, perhaps a lesson they had learned from their having half control of the corn supplies, you must control the entire chain, that having only partial responsibility was dangerous territory. They insisted on running the whole trash collecting operation themselves, with their own drivers. Whereas the other 8 communes quickly saw their trash collecting service fall apart with any minimal obstacle, this group of communards was able to face and address obstacles as they emerged, all in the spirit of cooperation. In effect, praxis makes things perfect. By controlling the full process, the Luisa Carceres communards could make the corrections that were needed. They could suffer the consequences of their own errors and enjoy the benefits of their successes, doing so in a context of mutual respect and recognition. The experience of Luisa Carceres Commune is a fascinating example of how things can work efficiently in a social context involving cooperation and mutuality in the workplace. To see how it played in the community at large, I followed the commune's garbage truck, lovingly baptized Lucho, as it made its rounds through the surrounding barrio. The whole process was a relatively ludic and extravagantly social undertaking. With a cluster of communards and neighbors crowded around it, the commune's garbage truck advanced slowly through the working-class zone, with its low-lying houses and small shops. The smell of ripe garbage notwithstanding, the entire operation had an air of a church picnic. People came out of their houses to talk with the drivers, since they're just as interested as the commune's workers in keeping the streets and city clean. Instead of the conflict that is always present when capitalist management is involved, an antagonism that affects both workers and clients, there was cooperation, a good atmosphere, and a festive spirit. Even the much-loved garbage truck was treated with affection and respect. The truck had a name and was part of the family. It is said that a moral economy is an essential part of working class consciousness. Instead of impersonal transactions based on economic value, the rational calculations of the abstract Homo economicus, the working class applies notions of fairness, reciprocity, and equilibrium to exchanges and other interactions. For this reason, in spaces that workers themselves control, attitudes and behaviors based on solidarity come into play, while consensus-based norms and obligations often trump strict considerations of value, transcending the so-called cash nexus. This is the positive side of a moral economy. Its benefits for a society and its members are evident. Yet any productive undertaking or service, even garbage collecting, requires resources. What is a fair compensation for the services rendered? That is a question the Luisa Carceres Commune had to face early on. Arriving at agreements with the neighbors was not an easy task, given that the 10 years of oil bonanza had accustomed Venezuelans to free services and made gifts from the government into the baseline for fairness in society. Even so, the communards were able to make inroads into popular consciousness by using persuasion and through the example they set in ensuring a regular service of garbage collection. Often, they would approach the issue of compensation obliquely, simply asking people if they were satisfied with the service and what they thought it was worth. They also began to direct their minimal overhead to social services, such as a women's center and other projects benefiting their neighborhood. All of this is part of the logic of a moral economy. A dense network of customs and traditions determines what is correct and acceptable, serving as the basis for appeals to the legitimacy that goes beyond mere legality. The communards at Luisa Carceres have tried to work this angle. However, it goes with the territory of the moral economy, and this is the negative side of responding to such a moral polity, that they are sometimes accused of being merely a local mafia, since they control resources that, despite social work and social outreach, are not yet under direct control of all members of the zone. Managing conflict and these kinds of contradictions in a socialist transition has become an important task for them. When you occupy or take charge of a public project, who will benefit initially, and how is this justified? These problems of community relations came to a head with a second project of the Commune, which is our next stop. That project is an occupied Merkel grocery store that is a short trek from the walled lot headquarters where the Commune's garbage collecting operation is based. The Luisa Carceres communards took over the storefront space a few years ago because it was not delivering the subsidized food that is the basic remit of Merkel, a distribution project dating from the early years of the Bolivarian process. The spirit of emulation also played a role in the occupation. The Luisa Carceres communards were in communication with comrades in the El Maizal, perhaps the most advanced commune in Venezuela, which was boldly seizing land in Lara State on the other side of the country at about the same time. The communards here wanted to advance too in their own territory. They were also aware that the Merkel storefront, which had fallen on hard times during the blockade, was about to be privatized. It was the moment to act. Since the store manager was a woman, the communards sent 3 women as a vanguard. Communal parliamentarian Ingrid Arcila, who is here in the storefront today, took part in the seizure. She explains how they went to the manager and said, "Good afternoon, please give us the keys and your phone." This Merkel is now in the hands of the Commune. Doing things in this gentle way, they eventually returned the manager's phone and allowed her to call her daughter. They wished to avoid projecting a bad image in the community. The manager understood that resisting the communal takeover was pointless. After the communards occupied the space, they cleaned it, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and repaired its refrigerators. Now, the Luisa Carceres-run Merkel offers bags of food to the community and maintains its facilities at a level it had never before enjoyed. The storefront is also a space for the community to meet and organize. Its walls are draped with complex charts related to food delivery and campaign mobilization in the zone. The Luisa Carceres Commune puts great emphasis on self-government. It is also among the most collectively organized communes and least prone to individualistic leadership of those we have visited in Venezuela. One of its spokespeople is Johan Tovar, who has taken time from caring for his 9-year-old to meet with us in the Merkel storefront this afternoon. We are interested in learning more about the commune building in this urban area, where the relation with the complex state apparatus is particularly thorny, involving close contact with the city government and its authorities. This is no minor issue, since Venezuela's rentier state, as it developed during the 20th century, has long been the focus of mass expectations due to its control of the oil wealth. In responding to our questions about the relationship with state power, Johan tells us about Chavez's attempts to remake and rethink the Venezuelan state from above. But he puts even more emphasis on grassroots practice in negotiating this relation. Johan tells us that the most important, experience-based lessons for the Luisa Carceres communards has been their growing awareness of the effectiveness and importance of self-organization. This has been learned from both their failures and their successes, which seem to depend directly on the degree of autonomous organization they have achieved. As Johan puts it, we discovered that communal organization is viable, and communes teach us that self-government and communal production is the way to get out of the current crisis. However, we still have a long way to go. Self-government cannot just be a matter of words. It cannot be always a precarious balancing act between popular power and institutions. Full autonomy of the process is a must. Otherwise, we would become an institutional appendix. In a country where the idea of the benefactor state has entered deeply into popular consciousness, so much so that Venezuelan anthropologist Fernando Coronil called it the magical state, grassroots autonomy will always be hard-won, and it will certainly be hotly contested during a socialist transition. However, Johan's defense of what he calls full autonomy and against the precarious balancing act of overdependence on state institutions resonates with the basic thesis of the communal path towards socialism, and the reason it can succeed where earlier, more statist socialist projects failed. The key point is that the communal strategy can succeed because it is more internally coherent than the state socialist model applied in the USSR and the other Eastern Bloc countries in the 20th century. Regarding the latter, Istvan Messeros once wrote that the Soviet system was like a person who falls because they try to sit in between two stools. His idea was that actually existing socialism was an incoherent hybrid of two mutually hostile systems, but without the efficiency or rationality of either one. Because of its composite nature, the Soviet system had problems with the control of the work process. It could neither apply the imposed external discipline of the capitalist overseer, nor could it rely on that of true socialist self-government, that is, the internal discipline of self-managed workers. This explains much of what happened to these countries, where there was essentially a problem of too little, not too much, socialism. Workers were told that the property of the means of production belonged to the whole society, including them, but they did not have a decisive role in determining how to employ the machinery or how to dispose of the product. For that reason, Soviet workers considered the socialist means of production to be not fully theirs, but someone else's, or most often, nobody's. Social property was established through legal decree, but it was not something real or truly felt. Stories about factory life in the USSR speak abundantly to this. There was an irrational use of resources, a host of bad labor practices, including purposeful waste, storming, last-minute drives to fulfill the plan, and hoarding of inputs, and eventually collapse. The communards at Luisa Carceres have seen something similar play out in Barcelona, where they found that the other communes, which had only partial control of the garbage removal project, essentially fell between two stools. Neither the state functionaries nor the communards took responsibility for the service. As had occurred in the Eastern Bloc, social property existed only on paper. The buck was continually passed, and the drivers eventually rebelled because they were not an integral part of the project. For these reasons, there is a continual push at Luisa Carceres Commune towards more self-government and greater self-management in the production. There is still much to be done, as the communards here are the first to admit. The most important thing, however, is that having chosen a coherent path, they are avoiding the impasse of the earlier socialist model. Visiting the Luisa Cáceres commune has been a learning experience because of the challenges that come from the urban context, including the proximity of state power. On our last day before leaving, we returned to the walled lot headquarters. It is midday and people are busy, sorting plastic material from the truck that has just come back from a morning round of garbage collection. We find ourselves examining a splendid mural on the commune's north wall that depicts the courageous patriot Luisa Cáceres herself, along with other Venezuelan notables. The young revolutionary appears here wearing a period dress alongside a rising sun and in the company of a communist poet, Aquiles Nassau. This has become the commune's preferred space for group photos, not selfies, and it is the symbolic and moral center of the commune. Standing before this mural, which connects the country's rebellious past with the communal future, it occurs to me how far this impressive commune is, in a social rather than physical sense, from the quotidian performance of individualism that most YouTubers, including Luisito Comunica, trade in. When the communards notice our presence, they take a break from sorting plastic to join us for photos in front of the mural. We take these pictures enthusiastically as mementos to eager shouts of "Comuna o nada!" Then, at the suggestion of Communard Rosa Cáceres, no relation to the eponymous forebearer on the mural, we devote some time to touring the commune's recycling operations, closely connected to the waste removal project that is their mainstay, and the community plant nursery they maintain. Urban gardening is something that became common in the Bolivarian process, often inspired by Cuban organoponic methods. These Cuban gardens have been extremely successful in their home country and have helped overcome the island's legacy of monoculture. In his last years, Fidel Castro himself took much interest in these gardens and fervently promoted the cultivation of multi-use moringa trees there, said to be an excellent food source and have other health properties. Here in this Venezuelan commune, urban ecology and conservation have been natural areas of work for the communards. They have found that simply by caring for urban spaces, they can preempt some of the sanitation problems in the city. For this reason, the communards use the plant nursery in this lot to cultivate ornamental flowers and bushes that they later place in spots that had formerly been used for dumping trash. Rosa tells us that the plants help people to see the city and its spaces as theirs, and to attend to them spontaneously on their own. One of our objectives here is to change the chemistry of sites that have become informal dumpsters, she says. The workers put the plants in strategic locations, often using old tires as planters, as they move around the city collecting garbage. The nursery also hosts edible plants and herbs. I asked about the moringa tree, wondering if the tidings of Fidel's pet project have gotten to this distant location. Rosa points to a scraggly but tall sapling with numerous dangling seed pods, one of which I eagerly pocket. Along with the plant nursery, the communards recycle both metal and plastic, providing an additional source of income. When the garbage truck Lucho arrives, the waste is carefully separated. Neighbors also bring bags of plastic bottles to the site. Recycling exists all around the world now, and the separation of waste has become a sort of global norm, with color-coded trash cans found in most major cities. However, the work in this commune has more social substance and economic importance than the recycling operations, or for that matter, most community gardens, of the global north. A visitor can see how the communards have adopted the globalized slogan, reduce, reuse, recycle, painting it on the commune's walls. The connection to a worldwide movement is likely meaningful for these communards. However, it is important to recognize that these terms mean something more substantial here. In the context of a Venezuelan commune, where reducing is imposed by the crisis and the blockade, reusing is a productive undertaking, and recycling an existential necessity. The slogan also goes hand in hand with new social relations. It is meaningful, too, that their community garden bears the name of Pablo Characo, a long-standing opponent of transgenic seeds in Venezuela. Characo was an organic intellectual and supporter of the Bolivarian process, who was born and lived not far from here. He died from COVID-19 last year, but bequeathed to the country and region an autochthonous corn variant called Guanape MFE, which he preserved and promoted as an alternative to imported seeds. This lifetime project was carried out in the midst of a process of national liberation and social emancipation. In the context of this robust commune, it is gratifying to observe the workings of a grassroots and socially integrated ecology, environmental practices connected to the much-needed transformation of social relations that is required if ecology is to go beyond being merely symbolic activity and well-meaning gestures. Monte Sinaí Commune in Valle de Guanape. Not all Venezuelan communes are success stories. It is part of Venezuelan culture to suck in one's gut and hold one's head high in the face of adversity. Still, this heroic attitude can't disguise the serious problems that many communes in the country face today. In itself, the communal project is a simple one, far simpler than navigating capitalist market relations. In a communal situation, one produces to help oneself and one's neighbors, with key decisions taken on the basis of people's needs and abilities. In fiction, it is common to represent scenarios of shipwreck and survival in these terms. Daniel Defoe's classic work Robinson Crusoe, 1719, made its mark because of the relative isolation of its army of one protagonist, who became the model for Homo economicus in much of classical economics. However, this work is an exception. In most survival and shipwreck stories, for example, even the baby boomers' favorite, Gilligan's Island, there is a varied group of individuals and a deliberative process takes place of assigning tasks according to abilities. Most likely, the popularity of survival fantasies is partly due to the attraction of their non-mercantile, more rational social relations. People find these situations interesting and meaningful, in contrast to the alienated labor relations they experience every day. Despite the simplicity of communal relations, getting there, as with any promised land, can be hard. This is because one is always already organized by capitalist relations, and extricating oneself or others from them can be an act worthy of Houdini. Indeed, the task is even harder than that of an escape artist, since many of the traps and chains are internal ones. In the Monte Sinaí commune in Valle de Guanape, these problems of inherited capitalist organizations are experienced in many varied ways. One is geographical. The roads in the region keep people separated in atomized groups, and this makes communal organizing more difficult, to say nothing of the complications their separation brings for sharing the production. Then there are the problems that come from Venezuela's being essentially an oil monoproducer, a situation that would not exist if it were not for capitalism's global market and the capital system's deep imbrication in fossil fuels. Finally, there is the problem of ideology, the capitalist common sense that informs our daily thought processes and activities. Overcoming that ideological barrier is actually impossible in the short term. There are no magic bullets. Surmounting it is only viable through some iterative process involving self-activity and reflection. At first, the Valle de Guanape zone, which has varied terrain and spreads across the states of Miranda and Anzoátegui, was organized as one huge commune. Yet, this soon proved intractable, and it was broken into 4 smaller communes. Monte Sinaí, the commune we are visiting on our second stop, which we get to by backtracking from Barcelona towards Miranda State, most likely has its name because the majority of its members are evangelical Christians. Arguably, however, it would have been more accurate to name the commune Monte Ararat, since the communards here are essentially shipwrecked. The families live off subsistence agriculture and also produce some coffee and cacao as cash crops. Unfortunately, their cacao yields are minimal, and the coffee crop is in poor shape because their aging trees produce very little. The communards at Monte Sinai know that to get things going, on the one hand, they have to improve the quality of the coffee trees, and on the other, they need to begin to process and thereby add value to the raw materials produced in agriculture. The commune is addressing the first problem, improving the quality of their crops, with its newly organized plant nursery. Here, with the support of the state-run Venezuelan Coffee Corporation, the Monte Sinai communards are cultivating C27 seedlings, a new coffee variety that has greater productivity and pest resistance. When our ride pulls into the abandoned city park where the nursery is located, we are received by Lenin Gonzalez, a veteran worker associated with the commune. Seated near the stream that runs through the park, he explains the project's whys and wherefores. Our objective now is to increase our production, which is very low now since most of the trees are old. Here in Guacamayo Park, we have a nursery, and we recently planted 32 kilos of C27 coffee seeds, which are sprouting right now. The commune has some 50,000 seedlings in the nursery, but the goal is to produce 1 million plants by 2023, which would fill Monte Sinai's hills with coffee trees. This is no small project. It might be an economic game changer for the commune, since a single hectare of C27 coffee can gross as much as $10,000 USD annually. The effort to transform raw materials is being pursued in the family production unit associated with Monte Sinai Commune, which is the next site we visit. This is a cassava wafer making project where bitter yucca is transformed using 1,000-year-old techniques. Not much has changed since pre-colonial times when Caribbean indigenous people grated, strained, and toasted poisonous yucca to make these durable wafers. This was once done with slender baskets, stone-embedded wooden graters, and heated stone surfaces. The result was a non-perishable food that was an important staple developed by Arawak and Carib peoples, who used it as a food supply during long voyages. Today, all that has changed is a small diesel motor that drives the cassava grinder, and an aluminum budare griddle that has been substituted for a stone cooking surface. There's even a sad, scrawny donkey that brings the yucca to the site, an animal that looks like it has walked out of a colonial epoch genre painting. Nothing could better illustrate the nature of the combined and uneven development that is typical of Latin America. Here in Venezuela, a 1,000-year-old process permits social reproduction, the reproduction of life, in a country whose principal commodity, literally, fuels advanced industrial production around the world. Our last stop in this struggling commune involves attending a meeting of the Monte Sinai communards in the village's public square. The gathering takes place in the shadow of a simple bust of Bolivar that presides over the square. One can easily observe how the speakers in this open space, even when talking about organizing the community and building socialism, make use of the inspirational style that is part of evangelical Christian culture. Communes and evangelical belief may seem like oil and water, but, in fact, great faith is needed to make a communal project go forward. That is, to build the communal everything out of the near nothing that these hopeful but destitute people live in. Speaking before those assembled is the gruff Alcadio Lemus, who is obviously the preacher in this community. He believes in the commune as much as he believes in his God. However, the project of emancipation that Alcadio is now promoting in this discourse, whatever its similarities to the spiritual one, has touched down on earth in this valley, and therefore involves both human and terrestrial emancipation. The words he uses to describe the goal are among the most purely revolutionary ones I have heard in some time. We know that commune building is a collective project. It's about the commons. As we understand it, a commune is about the pueblo organizing itself to produce and satisfy collective needs. Marx himself could hardly have said it better. Cinco fortaleces commune in Cumanacoa. Eastern Venezuela is a world not only of abundant oil reserves and privileged beachgoers, but also of sugarcane. The crop has long been grown in this region and forms an important part of the local diet, both in its homemade varieties, brown sugar loaves called panela or papelon, along with fresh squeezed guarapo, and in the pure crystalline form that results from industrial production. Even today, Eastern Venezuelans are notorious for eating their black beans with sugar, which is heaped in generous spoonfuls onto the steaming plates of this staple food after serving. This odd practice, hot beans seasoned with pure sugar, makes them the brunt of friendly ridicule from those who live in the center and west of the country. Native to Oceania and East Asia, the sugarcane plant came to this zone in the hands of the colonists, who initially used the forced labor of enslaved people both to grow it and to carry out the extensive process needed to turn the dark viscous liquid into pure white crystals. The market for sugar was huge because European industrialization created a demand for a food that supplied quick energy to workers under the new discipline of the factory whistle. Sugar production soon became highly industrialized in the plantation economies of Venezuela and the rest of the Caribbean. The harsh, coercive, and debilitating labor conditions and concentration of workers led to forms of class struggle more akin to that of an industrial proletariat than typical rural confrontations. The violence of capitalism, often hidden behind economic pressure in the global north, bared its teeth and came out in the open in these plantations, where it provoked responses in kind. Sugar workers' struggles were explosive, far-sighted, and revolutionary. Cuban intellectual Fernando Ortiz, famous for his work on sugar and tobacco, commented on the rebelliousness and political clarity of sugarcane workers who, quote, always have opposed interests to those of the owners and bosses, while poet and politician Aimé Césaire argued that Haiti's enslaved laborers in the sugar plantations, among the most glorious revolutionaries of all time, had acted like an industrial proletariat. Struggles over sugar production go on today, continuing this long-standing revolutionary tradition. In our trip through the eastern Venezuela region, our third and last stop takes us far inland to visit one of the most combative communes in the country. This is the Cinco Fortalezas commune that was forged in the crucible of conflicts over sugar-producing lands and later a dispute with the sugar mill. 20 years of the Bolivarian process have done little to mitigate the violence surrounding capitalist sugar production in these parts. Speaking from experience, Jusmeli Dominguez, one of the commune's key leaders, tells us how her parents grew up in the perimeter of sugarcane fields where they worked as day laborers. When I was a child, my parents had no land, and they worked for the terrateniente, landowner. We saw him getting richer and richer while we had nothing. They gave him their lives, and he gave them nothing in return. We are meeting in a patio of a former hacienda taken over by the commune, which overlooks their collective sugarcane fields. Jusmeli tells us how, roughly 10 years ago, people in the area began to occupy some abandoned fields and grow food crops there. This was the first step towards forming the Cinco Fortalezas commune. But the sugar planters responded swiftly, cruelly destroying their crops. Even so, the people rallied and held on to the land. And a few years later, they took over the sugar-producing lands of Hacienda Rosa, which became the commune's epicenter. These former day laborers were fighting a battle on two fronts. They had the landlords on one side and the sluggish state on the other. Unfortunately, they had to struggle with the Venezuelan state because it colluded with the owners by dragging its feet in recognizing their rights to the occupied land, despite how the communards' actions were backed up by the country's progressive 2001 land law. The latest chapter in the struggle is a pitched battle with the manager of the region's state-owned sugar mill, Juan Ramirez, who in 2021 bought all the crops in the area, including those of the commune, but never paid for them. This scam, valued at some $300,000 USD, sent whole communities in the area spiraling downward and cost them many lives, particularly among the old and unwell, who could no longer buy medicines. The Cinco Fortalezas communards have appealed their case concerning the unpaid-for crops both to the state governor and the central government, but their complaints have gone unanswered. Their only option has been to carry out a strike, refusing to harvest their sugar fields, which stretch out before us from our vantage point on the patio. At the same time, the communards are looking for other sugar processing options, including a 19th century trapiche they have discovered nearby, and hope to soon repair. Meanwhile, Juan Ramirez is refitting the sugar mill to process crude sugar from Argentina as a way of turning his back on local growers entirely, and making the state-owned mill independent of the country's endogenous production. A bloody, no-holds-barred battle of this kind requires enormous collective willpower and deep commitment. How else to survive the slings and arrows of capitalism's outrageous fortune? One of the things that most surprises me about this commune is the serene good humor of its militants and easygoing atmosphere they project in their speech and actions. It is marvelous how a dire situation and constant struggle have made them more, and not less, hospitable. Shortly after we arrive, the communards generously serve us lunch and converse with us over coffee and guarapo. The hot sun makes visiting the fields impossible at midday, but they're also eager to show us one of their secret weapons in the struggle against capitalism. This is the mandala, a thatched hut structure they have built in the center of a circular herb garden. The communards at Cinco Fortalezas describe their mandala as a space for reflection, meeting, and building community. Some aspects of the project can seem a bit hokey, since, for example, one enters the structure from one of 4 cardinal points, depending on one's astrological sign. However, their mandala hut becomes quite a bit less contrived once you realize that every communal project needs a symbolic set of references of this kind. That is because all communes in Venezuela today are under construction, and many features of communal work and life will necessarily be materially indistinguishable, for a while at least, from what one experiences and does in the non-communal world. Everything in these contexts is incomplete and in process. For this reason, only a discursive or symbolic register that expresses the intention of going in another direction, toward the goal of a communal society or socialism, can mark the commune's daily work as different, casting an alternative light on their activities, and infusing a socialist spirit to practices such as tending a field or milking a cow, that are often materially identical to those one has always done. Philosophers of mind have long pointed out how intentional states are notoriously inscrutable. How to discern the true motives of a person's actions. For Venezuela's commune builders, this is not a philosophical, but a practical problem. It is the problem of how to create outward signs or marks, or what is sometimes called mística in Latin America's grassroots movements, to let everyone know that an arduous and often inglorious work of planting a field, harvesting a crop, milking cows, or tending to children belongs to a shared project that is moving in an emancipatory direction. In Cinco Fortalezas commune, this is done with the mandala. In El Maizal commune, there is the monument to Chavez and the nearby Canaí meeting space. In the Che Guevara commune, there are strategically located murals that adorn its concrete infrastructure. Even the hard-hit communards in Monte Sinai have their unique hybrid of evangelical faith and socialist science. Indeed, a quick review of the existing projects in Venezuela's communal movement reveals that most functional communes have something like this. Just as tellingly, it is the most problematic and precarious ones that lack a strong symbolic register. When we're gathered in the mandala, seated on rocks around the hut's perimeter, we are told to let the overhanging thatch touch our hair. I am secretly hoping that this will be our last brush with anything approaching the esoteric. However, Jusmeli soon lets us have it with a blast of Communard Mystica. Everything from the rocks to the wood, to the plants that surround this mandala, comes from communal lands, she says to all those assembled. The mandala's architectural form, with its 4 entrances, is loaded with symbolism, collective work, solidarity, and happiness. Chavez's spirit lives on here. We are his sons and his daughters because we carry him in our hearts and in our consciousness. Despite my mistrust of such metaphysical language in other contexts, I can see how Jusmeli's discourse actually works in a very different, more practical register. Not only does it accompany real work and real struggle, but it also orients this project in a revolutionary direction. Indeed, without such mystica, all you would have in this commune in strictly material terms is the same person cutting cane, the same half-functional tractor, the same scrawny dog as you had under capitalism. With Mystica, on the other hand, you can understand that the person cutting the cane under the hot sun, the half-functional tractor, and the malnourished dog are all headed towards socialism. Mystica marks daily activities with hopeful intentionality and a positive directionality. However, Mystica is only as good as the material reality it works to mediate. Surely because she is aware of this, Jusmeli next takes us abruptly back to earth to discuss the harsh social and political realities that these embattled communards are facing today. She does so without the faintest trace of otherworldliness. We are still in a capitalist state that is guided by particular interests, she says. In Venezuela, capitalism seems to have gotten control of the state and its institutions, and they don't believe in the bases. It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the edge has been taken off the heat. So we head out into the fields, amid the snaky sugarcane stalks. Now we are accompanied by communal leader Vanessa Perez. Here in the commune, all the main leadership roles are occupied by women. Vanessa, who has been involved in forming the Communard Union, see Chapter 6, wants to tell us about their various projects, including fish farming and social work, and their plans for the future. Using a metaphor that has become common in Venezuela's popular movement, she says that sugar growing is this commune's PDVSA. This figure of speech requires some unpacking. The idea is that just as the profits from Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, were used by Chavez to diversify production and finance social projects, each commune should do the same on a micro scale, with some surplus-generating project financing its other activities. Hence, a PDVSA refers to a goose that lays the golden eggs. It could be large-scale corn crop, as in El Maizal commune, trash collection and recycling, as in Luisa Carceres commune, or coffee and chocolate production, as in Che Guevara commune, or something else depending on the region. In his discourses, Chavez often followed 20th century Venezuelan intellectual Arturo Uslar Pietri in referring to the reinvesting of oil profits as sowing petroleum, sembrando petróleo. Here in Cinco Fortalezas commune, the idea would be, though it is much less poetic, to diversify production and invest in the community by sowing sugar. Diversifying production and altering the production apparatus is an urgent problem in the country, just as it is worldwide. Here in Venezuela, the communal path towards socialism provides a theoretical template for this transformation. This is because an important part of communal life would be communal consumption, which involves adjusting consumption to people's true, more rational and sustainable needs. Capitalism disconnects production and consumption. The two are separated by market mechanisms and the commodity fetish. But communes bring the two together and allow us to ask such questions. Do people really need fossil fuels and sugar? And if so, how much of them? For these issues to be resolved in a way that is not paternalistic or authoritarian, they must, of course, be sorted out democratically. Vanessa tells us how in Cinco Fortalezas Commune, they are trying to expand their projects, both in a productive and social sense, based on sugar profits. The surplus produced by the sugarcane allows us to do work in the territory, from fixing the school or the roads, to public lighting, to getting medicine for those who need it, etc. It has also been used to start cultivating some food crops, such as peanuts, and to finance fish farming, which could be a good source of protein. At our last stop, Vanessa takes us to look at some tilapia ponds, where bright red fish swim in the shadow of the huge, bizarrely twisted cane stalks. These plants seem to have gone wild, like fairy tale bean stalks, because they have been unharvested for so long. Looking at the fish, a small project embodying much hope for the future, all of which is surrounded by overgrown acres of a centuries-old plantation crop, I cannot help thinking about the complexity of the transition to communal socialism. The long-term aim may be clear, but the means for getting there are by no means simple, since almost surely continuing some level of sugar growing and unfortunately, some petroleum extraction is needed in the immediate future before Venezuelans can abandon these problematic crops and resources and move towards something more humanely useful and sustainable. Purism is impossible here, if for no other reason than for the moment, the badness of sugar and the evil of petroleum are needed in this context to promote the goodness of something else. Perhaps the mysticism of the nearby mandala has affected my brain, but I cannot help thinking how this represents a kind of socialist catch-22, or is at least akin to Messeros's puzzle of a house having to be rebuilt from within. See chapter 4. It is a difficult task, but not a thankless one. In the next chapter, we will look at an important effort to address such problems of the socialist transition by communes joining forces, pooling resources, and sharing information.